As we've been reporting, President Biden is currently attending the G7 summit in Cornwall, England, for his first overseas trip as president. The three-day event brings together top leaders from the UK, Canada, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, and the US. Discussions this year have been centered around the coronavirus pandemic. The 7 leaders agreed Friday to donate 1 billion doses of coronavirus vaccines to low-income countries, and half of those doses are expected to come from the U.S. For more, I want to bring in 60 Minutes correspondent John Dickerson. John's moderating this Sunday's Face the Nation. John, great to see you. So how did the G7 leaders come to a decision on 1 billion doses? And what does it mean that the U.S. is responsible for half of those?
Well, they came to the decision in that that's what each of the countries could come up with. Actually, the need is into the billions of doses that are required. And the reasoning for both the U.S. and the other members of the largest economies is basically the same, which is it's both moral and it's a health measure. Morally, these countries argue that they have an obligation as the richest nations to help those that are developing, that are in worse shape, and that are seeing the brunt of some of the worst parts of the pandemic. But then also, just as a health matter, they know that the longer the pandemic is out there raging, it can jump over borders very quickly. And so to eradicate the pandemic as best as possible on the globe is really the only way these developing nations can be assured that they won't face variants or spikes in their countries as they try to come out into a more normal kind of life as people get vaccinated.
And John, what else will this group of 7 leaders be discussing? Are any other deals expected to come out of the summit this weekend?
Not clear about deals. There will be a lot of language and what they're really trying to do is a couple of things. One, repair the relationships. All of these European leaders had a bristling relationship with President Trump, and both in specific terms, country-to-country relationships, but also in terms of the project of liberal democracies in the globe. And that project is a common set of values and agreements on certain kinds of things that promote those values, often against other countries that are run by autocrats or despots. And so sort of rebuilding the agreements of the international order is one of the things that they'll be doing. And they will aim a lot of their concern towards Russia and China. China perhaps in particular, because while Russia is a mischievous country and has a lot of nuclear weapons, it doesn't have the economic power that China has. And China has been working its way into both the developing world and the developed world. Militarily, they've been building up, but in these economic ways, they've been working their ways into other countries to spread their influence. And President Biden is trying to rally G7 nations and European nations and even NATO to act as a counterweight against the aims of the Chinese government.
And as we were seeing photos from the G7 summit, we saw Queen Elizabeth there. President Biden is expected to have a one-on-one meeting with her on Sunday. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's symbolic, of course. It's basically entirely symbolic of the strong relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. In the president's remarks the other day when he announced the 500 million doses, he talked about the Atlantic Charter, which was signed between Churchill and FDR 80 years ago, and also about the arsenal of democracy. He talked about the arsenal of vaccines. He was echoing all of these World War II phrases and moments of history to reiterate the strength of the relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And so the meeting with the Queen is a part of that. And this, again, is a part of this symbolic reconstruction of America's role in the world with its allies, trying to promote a certain set of values in the globe. And so that is done through specific action, but also through a lot of the symbolic things that one does as a U.S. president. And if you're going to be in the UK, you have to pay a visit to the Queen.
I would certainly go if she asked. All right, John. So while the president is away, obviously back in Washington, work still continues on infrastructure. A group of 5 Democratic senators and 5 Republican senators proposed a new bipartisan infrastructure deal on Friday. What more can you tell us about how that's going?
Well, it's an agreement that's about $1 trillion less than what President Biden wanted. It is a glimmer of bipartisan hope, but there are many hurdles yet to go. Anything that passes the Senate has to do so with 60 votes because of the filibuster. So for anything to pass, essentially the president has to find 10 Republican votes. And then the question is, any bill that gets 10 Republican votes, is it going to keep the 50 Democratic votes, or is the president going to lose some of his more liberal members in the Senate? Then, if anything could get through the Senate with 60 votes, the question is, what would it look like when they agree to a final bill? Would it be able to pass the House? Probably not. You would lose a lot of Democratic liberals, which means you'd need a bunch of Republican votes. Well, if you need Republican votes, that means Nancy Pelosi needs the help of Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader. They're not exactly pals, and so that kind of working together on an agreement that could pass the House is also going to be something that's going to be quite tricky. And remember, this is a deal that won't be what President Biden wants. So we'll have to see whether the president would agree to a deal that's a lot less than what he wanted, because at the base, though, is the fact that this would fund bridges and roads and lots of the infrastructure that was required, not only to help the economy in the short term, but really to help America in the longer term as well.
So interesting thinking about the conversation that you and I had last week about the impasse on that infrastructure deal and seeing this bipartisan group coming together. We'll have to see how the White House and, as you say, all the rest of those players decide to act. John, thanks so much for joining.
Sure thing.